The lights in El Paso had barely faded when everything started to feel off. From the audience's perspective, it had been another flawless night. The energy was electric, the choreography sharp, the vocals steady even under the weight of a roaring crowd. To ARMY, it looked like perfection. But behind the stage, where the cameras didn't always reach and the cheers softened into distant echoes, a very different moment was unfolding, one that only a few people noticed in real time and even fewer fully understood. Jimin had pushed himself hard that night, maybe harder than usual. There were small signs, almost invisible unless you were looking for them, a slightly delayed step during one transition, a breath that came just a fraction too heavy between lines, the way his hand briefly pressed against his side as the lights dimmed between songs. Nothing obvious, nothing enough to alarm fans watching from afar, but to someone who knew him, really knew him, those details weren't small at all, and Jungkook noticed everything. It started the moment they stepped off stage. The adrenaline was still high, the air thick with heat and sweat, staff members moving quickly around them as they transitioned into backstage mode. Usually, this was the part where the members would laugh, tease each other, maybe replay a funny mistake, or celebrate a strong performance. But that night, Jungkook's focus narrowed almost instantly. Jimin wasn't following the usual rhythm. He walked slower, not dramatically, just enough to feel out of sync. His shoulders, usually relaxed after a performance, seemed tense, almost fragile under the harsh backstage lighting. He tried to smile when a staff member approached him, tried to nod like everything was fine, but there was a slight wavering in his stance that didn't go unnoticed. Jungkook's eyes were already on him. There's something people often say about Jungkook, that he's observant, but that word barely scratches the surface when it comes to Jimin, because when it's Jimin, it's not just observation, it's instinct. He didn't ask right away. He moved closer first, close enough that if Jimin stumbled, he'd be there before gravity even had a chance to do its job. Close enough that their shoulders brushed for just a second, a silent check-in, one that didn't need words. Hung. Jungkook's voice was low, almost lost in the noise around them. Jimin turned slightly, offering that familiar soft smile. "I'm okay," he said quickly. Too quickly. That was the moment Jungkook knew, because Jimin had a habit, one he'd never really been able to break. He would always say he was okay first, always reassure before being asked, always put comfort ahead of honesty, and Jungkook had learned that pattern long ago. They kept walking, or at least they tried to. It happened in a split second. Jimin's step faltered, not dramatically enough to draw attention from everyone, but enough for his balance to shift, for his body to lean just slightly in the wrong direction, for that invisible line between fine and not fine to finally break. He almost fell, but he didn't, because Jungkook didn't let go. The movement was immediate, instinctive, one hand reaching out, firm and sure, catching Jimin at his side while the other steadied his arm. It wasn't rough, it wasn't panicked, it was precise, like he'd done it before, like his body already knew exactly how to hold him without hesitation. "Hey," he said softly, leaning in just enough so only Jimin could hear, "I've got you." And that was it. No dramatic exclamations, no calling for attention, just those three words, grounded and steady. Jimin didn't argue this time. That might have been the most telling part. Instead, his hand instinctively gripped the fabric of Jungkook's sleeve, fingers curling slightly as if anchoring himself. His head dipped for a second, not in embarrassment, but in surrender to the moment, to the fact that, for just now, he didn't have to pretend. Jungkook adjusted his hold, not just supporting, but holding. There was a subtle difference. Support can be temporary, distant, careful not to cross boundaries, but this was close, protective, familiar in a way that spoke of years, of trust built quietly over time. He guided Jimin towards a quieter corner backstage, away from the immediate rush. His hand never left him, not even for a second. Staff members began to notice. There were glances exchanged, quiet murmurs, the kind of subtle awareness that spreads quickly in a space like that. But no one interrupted, no one stepped in too quickly, because there was something about the way Jungkook handled it that made it clear he had it under control. "Sit," Jungkook murmured once they reached a bench. Jimin hesitated, not because he wanted to refuse, but because sitting down felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to fully say out loud. His pride, his professionalism, his constant drive to push through, it all flickered across his expression in that brief pause. Jungkook saw it. Of course he did, and instead of pushing harder, his voice softened. "Just for a minute," he added quieter to this time. That was what did it. Jimin exhaled, the tension in his shoulders finally loosening as he allowed himself to sit. Jungkook stayed close, too close maybe for something purely casual, one hand still resting lightly against Jimin's arm, as if ready to steady him again at any moment. "Why didn't you say anything?" Jungkook asked. There was no accusation in his tone, just concern. Jimin let out a small, breathy laugh. "It wasn't that bad." Jungkook didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at him, really looked at him. At the slight pallor in his skin, the way his breathing hadn't fully settled yet, the faint tremor that still lingered in his fingers. "Young," he said finally, softer than before, "you almost fell." Jimin's smile faded just a little. For a moment, neither of them spoke. And in that silence, something unspoken passed between them, something heavier than the situation itself. Because this wasn't just about one moment backstage, it was about a pattern, about how often Jimin pushed himself past his limits, about how often Jungkook was the one quietly catching him before anyone else noticed. "I didn't want to worry you," Jimin admitted after a while. The honesty in that sentence landed deeper than anything else. Jungkook's expression shifted, not into frustration, but something more complex, something softer, tinged with a kind of quiet ache. "You don't have to do that," he said. Jimin looked at him, eyes searching. "I'm already worried," Jungkook added, almost with a small, helpless smile. That did something. You could see it in the way Jimin's gaze softened, in the way his shoulders finally dropped their last layer of tension. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was real. And Jungkook's hand never moved. Even as staff approached with water, even as the noise of backstage life slowly crept back in, even as Jimin insisted again that he was fine now, Jungkook stayed right there. Close, steady, unmoving in the one way that mattered most. Because for him, this wasn't just a moment. It never was. What happened next didn't explode into chaos. There were no loud alarms, no frantic rush that would later turn into headlines. Instead, it unfolded in a way that felt almost quiet, controlled, intimate in a space that was usually anything but. Jimin sat there for a while, elbows resting lightly on his knees, fingers still loosely curled as he focused on steadying his breath. The rush of the performance was wearing off, and with it, the thin layer of adrenaline that had kept him going longer than his body probably wanted. Jungkook stayed beside him, not in a way that felt suffocating, but close enough that there was no question he wasn't going anywhere. A staff member handed Jimin a bottle of water, and he accepted it with a small nod, murmuring a quiet, "Thank you." He lifted it to his lips, taking a careful sip. Even that seemed measured, like he was recalibrating himself piece by piece. Jungkook watched the entire time, not in a way that felt invasive, but attentive, grounded, as if every small movement Jimin made was being silently assessed, filed away, understood. "Better?" Jungkook asked after a moment. Jimin nodded. "Yeah, just needed a second." It was a simple answer. Too simple, maybe. But this time, Jungkook didn't push back immediately. Instead, he shifted slightly closer. His hand, which had been resting lightly on Jimin's arm, moved just a fraction, enough to feel more secure, more intentional. His thumb brushed once, almost unconsciously, against the fabric of Jimin's sleeve. It was such a small gesture, but it said everything. Around them, the backstage energy was slowly returning to normal, members moving in and out of the space, staff coordinating schedules, the distant hum of post-show activity filling the air. And yet, there was this small pocket, this quiet center, where time seemed to slow just a little. A few of the members glanced over, not with surprise, not even with concern, just a kind of knowing look. Because this dynamic, this quiet way Jungkook stayed anchored to Jimin when something felt off, it wasn't new. It had just never been this visible. "Do you want to go to the dressing room?" Jungkook asked. Jimin hesitated again, but this time it wasn't about pride. It was about the moment. Because getting up meant moving forward, rejoining the noise, stepping back into the rhythm of everything else. And right now, in this small pause, there was something grounding about staying exactly where he was, with Jungkook right beside him. Still, he nodded. "Yeah, let's go." Jungkook stood first, and then, without making a big deal of it, he reached out. Not dramatically, not in a way that demanded attention, just a simple extension of his hand. Jimin looked at it for a split second. And then, he took it. The contact was brief, just enough for Jungkook to help him up, but it lingered in a way that felt deliberate, like both of them were aware of it, even if neither said anything. Once Jimin was steady on his feet, Jungkook didn't immediately pull away. Instead, his hand shifted again, this time resting lightly at Jimin's back, protective, guiding, close. They started walking, and this time, the difference was clear. Jimin's steps were still careful, but steadier than before, more grounded. Whether it was the rest, the water, or simply the presence beside him, it was hard to tell. But Jungkook stayed in sync, matching his pace exactly. If Jimin slowed, Jungkook slowed. If Jimin adjusted, Jungkook adjusted. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention, but once you noticed it, you couldn't unsee it. They reached the dressing room without incident. Inside, the atmosphere shifted again, more private, more contained. The noise softened, replaced by the familiar comfort of the space that belonged to them, even if only temporarily. Jimin sat down again, this time more naturally. Jungkook stayed standing for a second, watching him. There was a pause, and then, "You scared me." The words were quiet, but they carried weight. Jimin looked up, surprised, not at the concern, but at how directly it was said. Jungkook rarely phrased it like that. Usually, his worry came out in actions, in quiet gestures, in the way he stayed close, the way he noticed things before anyone else. But this was different. Jimin's expression softened almost instantly. "I'm sorry," he said, just as quietly. Jungkook shook his head. "No, just..." He stopped himself, exhaling slightly, like he was trying to find the right words. "Just tell me next time." There it was again. Not a demand, not frustration, just a simple request. A line drawn not out of control, but out of care. Jimin held his gaze for a moment longer. And then, he nodded. "I will." There was something about the way he said it this time that felt more certain, more real, and Jungkook seemed to feel it too, because his shoulders relaxed, just a little. The tension that had been sitting quietly beneath everything, finally easing. For a few minutes, things returned to normal, or at least as normal as they could be. Outfits were adjusted, towels passed around. Laughter slowly crept back into the room as the other members filtered in, bringing with them the familiar warmth that always followed a performance. But even as the atmosphere shifted, one thing didn't change: Jungkook's position. He stayed close, Not always touching, not always speaking, but always there. At one point, when Jimin leaned back slightly, closing his eyes just for a second, Jungkook noticed immediately. "You okay?" he asked again. Jimin let out a small laugh, eyes still closed. "You're going to keep asking, aren't you?" Jungkook didn't hesitate. "Yeah." The answer was simple, certain. And somehow that made Jimin smile even more, because beneath the teasing, beneath the exhaustion, beneath everything else, there was something steady there, something he could rely on without question. Time passed, slowly at first, then all at once, the kind of time that feels stretched in the moment, only to collapse into something small once it's over. Eventually, the staff began signaling for the next transition, whether it was moving to another location, preparing to leave, or simply wrapping up the night. Jimin stood again, this time without hesitation, without wavering. But still, Jungkook moved with him. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Because somewhere along the way, that had become the default. As they made their way out, there was one last moment, small enough that most people would miss it. Jimin's hand brushed lightly against Jungkook's, just for a second. It could have been accidental, it could have been nothing, but Jungkook reacted instantly, his fingers shifting just slightly, catching that contact, holding it for half a heartbeat longer than necessary before letting go. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to, because sometimes the quietest moments carry the most meaning. And this wasn't just about one night in El Paso. It wasn't just about a near fall or a moment of exhaustion or even the way Jungkook reached out without thinking. It was about a pattern, a rhythm, a kind of understanding that had been built slowly, over years, through countless moments just like this one. Some seen, most unseen. The way Jungkook notices, the way Jimin leans, even if just a little. The way neither of them makes it bigger than it needs to be, and yet somehow it means everything. Because in a world that's loud, fast, and constantly watching, there are still moments like this. Quiet, unscripted, real. And maybe that's why it stayed with people. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was perfect, but because it felt honest. Because for a brief second backstage in El Paso, something slipped through the cracks of performance and professionalism, and what was left behind wasn't choreography or stage presence. It was care. Simple, steady, unquestionable care. And that's the part fans can't stop thinking about. Because you can fake a lot of things on stage, but you can't fake instinct. You can't fake the way someone reaches out without hesitation. You can't fake the kind of closeness that shows up not when the lights are on, but when they've just gone out. So maybe the real story isn't that Jimin almost fell. Maybe it's that Jungkook was already there before he could, that he didn't wait, didn't question, didn't hesitate. He just held on. And somehow, in a world full of noise, that quiet certainty said more than anything else ever could. If this moment stayed with you too, if you felt that subtle shift, that quiet intensity that didn't need words, then maybe you saw it the same way others did. Not as something loud, but as something real.